Coming into this session, Governor, there was a lot of conversation surrounding the structural deficit that the state was facing. And now the House just passed the budget plan with $1.6 billion in taxes. What do you say to Marylanders who are going to have to reach into their pockets and pay the additional taxes and fees that have just been passed?
Well, I'd say that we walked into this session dealing with an inherited structural deficit, and we're going to leave session with a surplus. And I'm going to say to middle-class families, you're just getting a tax cut. You know, when I think about where we are right now, the fact that we could turn a deficit into a surplus, the fact that middle-class families are about to get a tax cut, the majority of Maryland families are going to get a tax cut. 94% of Maryland families either get a tax cut or see no changes in their taxes at all. And the fact that we have been able to make the largest amount of cuts in over a generation in Maryland state budget. It's close around $2.5 billion of cuts, and still make historic investments in public education and public safety. I'm grateful for where we are, especially when you consider the type of headwinds, economic headwinds that have happened over these past 10 weeks.
Given what is included in this with the tire tax, the vehicle excise tax that is going up, the increase in registration fees that are happening quicker, is it really fair to say that 94% of people will see no change or a tax break in their income taxes when they will have to be paying these other taxes and fees?
I think it's absolutely fair, because I think it's the numbers, especially when you consider an environment on a federal side when the new administration in Washington has basically just given this country a national sales tax. Because of these tariff policies, everything is going to be more expensive on everybody. When you consider what's happening with Elon Musk's Doge cuts, when you're having more people, thousands of people, Marylanders, who are now unemployed, the fact that despite that, we now have a budget that is actually going to make sure we are investing in our roads and investing in our tunnels, investing in 81 and 15, and actually fixing transportation, a budget that is going to give the majority of Marylanders a tax cut. I think, especially when you consider what's happening on the federal level, the fact that this state can say the governor is making sure that he's holding firm on his promise of getting the middle class a tax cut, I think people can, and people do feel thankful for that, especially when you consider everything else going on.
Given what everything is going on when it comes to the tariffs and everything at the federal level, people will still see the headlines with $1.6 billion in tax increases, though. Do you think that they really will be thankful for a government who is taxing them more, given the fact that we are seeing all of the other federal actions?
I think you are watching a state government that is giving the middle class a tax cut in this moment. I think you are going to watch a state government that's about to do the largest amount of cuts to a Maryland state budget that we have seen literally in over a generation. I think you're watching a state government that is now going on the third straight year where we are actually having a general fund that is smaller than the year before. We have decreased the size of state government every single year, and at the same time increased efficacy. We've decreased the size of state government, and we've also been able to do things like have historic drops in violent crime. Also do things like making historic investments in public education, having historically low unemployment rates. And so I think people are seeing that this is not just what fiscal discipline looks like, this is what good governance looks like, and how to properly maintain a balance sheet, especially at a time when you were watching people's retirements being blown apart with the stock market, people's employment being thrown off to the side with Elon Musk's Doge cuts, and when you're watching the type of challenges that we're seeing with the larger economic decisions like these universal tariff policies, which is a universal sales tax on this country right now.
Well, you bring up good governance. Do you think that it is good governance to pass a tech tax when we're hearing from all of the budget leaders say we're going to have to figure out later who actually pays it, who it applies to, and how the state's going to really capture this revenue?
Well, I think what you're looking at is how can you make sure that you are modernizing a tax code, because there's no one who looks at Maryland's tax code and says this thing makes sense. No one looks at a tax code and says that someone making $30 million is paying the same as a household who makes $300,000. That tax code does not make sense. And it's the same thing on a corporate side. And so when you're watching a balancing where you're actually putting us more in line with not just people around states around the country, but also even our neighbors, about the fact that Maryland has moved from a goods-based economy to a services-based economy, but also saying that I was very clear at the beginning of session. There are certain industries that are our lighthouse industries: IT, life sciences, aerospace and defense. And then when you look at the data tax that's added in, which again is modernizing our tax code, there are carve-outs for the industries that I think are really our lighthouse industries. Things like quantum and AI and IP, intellectual property. So these are things I thought was important, that yes, we can modernize a tax code, but at the same time, let's also not hinder the kind of growth and the diversification off of a Washington economy that our state needs right now.
Parts of the carve-outs people have said is the state picking winners and losers because the carve-out for the quantum industry is in College Park. Why not make quantum the industry-wide so that investments can be made in other areas of the state and not just in one specific area?
Well, because it's data. Because the data continues to show that these are industries that have an outsized potential of really being explosive for growth. And they are things that helps to diversify us off of Washington, which was a core goal. And let's be clear, when you're looking at the larger economy, the history of the larger economy has been how are you thinking about which industries should get greater acceleration versus others. That's no change. That's the way the economy has worked for existence. We do have to be clear, though, that if you have assets within our state, why are we not investing in those assets that can get a greater return? And that's really what we were trying to do and trying to highlight things like cyber and quantum and AI and life sciences and aerospace and defense. There's no reason for these other states to be beating us in those industries. The only difference is that historically, we have not invested in those things. And that's why we saw that our economy had essentially flatlined over the past decade. We are finally starting to see progress in our economy now. We're finally starting to see labor force participation picking up. We are finally starting to see new job starts, which are new business starts, which are growing for the state of Maryland for the first time in a decade. We're finally starting to see population increases in the state of Maryland and in Baltimore City for the first time in a decade. We've got to make sure we're investing properly, and that means investing in industries we have a unique chance of winning at.
But budget leaders have said that the details of how this will really be applied aren't clear, but yet lawmakers are passing this plan right now. How does that make sense for people to pass something that the details aren't really clear on how the state's going to capture this revenue, and the projections are based on the expectations of $480-some million for the tech tax? If the details aren't sure, why should lawmakers pass this plan?
Well, I think when we're talking about when they're saying, and again, I can't speak for them,
Sure,
or what they said, but what I know is that whenever you're placing in new frameworks, whether it is things like the tax cuts that we have put into place, or any other type of way you're relooking at ways you're doing any type of adjustments, that there is adjustments that need to be made that have to be incorporated, that you have to operationalize it. So again, I can't speak for budget leaders. I actually didn't hear them say that, and I definitely can't speak for them. But the thing that I know is that we've got to make sure we're properly operationalizing everything we're putting together in this budget.
If these projections of the anticipation of all of these new taxes and generating for the state don't bear out, and it's lower than expected, do you think that we'll be here next year looking and having the same conversation, looking at new ways to generate taxes, especially during an election year?
No, I think the thing we've got to focus on is growth. We've got to grow this economy. If we're not growing the economy, we're just simply talking about managing decline. And I refuse to stand here and manage decline. We inherited an economy that essentially had flatlined. There was no growth. And so the problem was, you saw for the 7 years before I became the governor, that spending increased by 70%. And economic growth was essentially flat. That's what created the structural deficit that we ended up inheriting. And when you have that, you then are just basically trying to cut your way to prosperity.
But do you think that you're going to grow the economy by implementing all of these other taxes that could potentially push the job creators out of Maryland?
You're going to grow the economy by doing things like we just did, which is essentially putting over $130 million into advancing new industries, into growing the economy, into incentivizing businesses to be able to come and grow and stay here. You're going to grow the economy by doing things like we did, which is putting together proposals around procurement reform and permitting reform and regulatory reform, and making it easier for businesses to grow and stay in the state of Maryland. There's a reason why we are finally seeing new business starts increase in the state of Maryland, right? That businesses are finding the state of Maryland to be a place to come and grow and stay and scale and build. We've got to make sure we're accelerating that. We have to make sure we have capital that's investing in these new type of industries. That's what's going to create the kind of economic growth, because the truth is, if we had a greater measure of economic growth over the past decade Do you know what we never would have inherited? A structural deficit. The reason we inherited a structural deficit is because the economy had flatlined and it was not growing in comparison to our neighbors. We can address all of these issues by just focusing on one word: growth.
What if these policies and this growth plan, what if this gamble doesn't work?
Listen, I worked on Wall Street and in finance, so I understand how finances work. I was a small business owner. I understand how to meet payroll. I ran one of the largest poverty-fighting organizations in this country. I understand data. These type of investments are the exact kind of investments that our state needs to make in order to spur measurements of economic growth so we can increase the top line, we can control our spending. If we do those two things, this economy will grow, and it needs to.